Now, there's an understandable tendency, both here and elsewhere in trust properties, to try to establish an explicitly moral line about what we're looking at. But you have to be careful. Instructing visitors what to think can come across, and does, I think, often come across, as exclusionary as red ropes and teasels. There are no correct answers to those questions, nor is it clear to me who has a right to decide about them. I'm not trying to frown on the simple pleasures of a good day out and a National Trust scone. They're very pleasant. But don't let's forget that these houses, being in them, looking around them, immersing yourself in them, questioning them, these houses are also an almost unrivaled laboratory for facing the complexity of history, for seeing it afresh, for owning it and debating it. And people, both old and young, want to debate the past. I emphasise the old too here, because I think it's a pernicious ageist myth to suggest that people my age are all dutifully respectful and a bit forelock-tugging and happy to go along with whatever we might have been fed at school half a century ago without questioning it. It's not just Gen Z that wants to have an argument. Thank you, yeah, that was the right audience to choose for that, wasn't it? So if we think that that's important, how is the debate fostered? What does it sound like? And on whose terms? And I want to highlight just two aspects of this very briefly. First, if you want to get people debating the past on display in historic houses, people have got to be able to take their time, to feel they belong, or have a right to be there. Now, in general, over the last 30 years or so, we've seen a growth of what I call the blue glovification of the past, a shared sense that the past is beyond the reach of human hand to be preserved but not touched unless you're wearing those blue gloves. Now, the commonest complaint I get when I do a telly programme is that I have dared actually to touch something Roman. In the case of the trust, blue glovification comes in the form of red ropes and those awful teasels on chairs, right? Right? Oh, how we hate them, right? They tell you in their passive-aggressive way you're not allowed to sit down, right? Awful, right? And for me, there's nothing worse than seeing visitors shuffling around a house on the other side of a barrier and never stopping to engage with anything because there's nowhere to sit, right? That's being excluded from the past. It's not owning it. We could, I think, be less risk-averse. Of course, there are some objects so precious that you would never want people getting too close, let alone putting their sticky fingers on them. But there are fewer of those than we imagine. And in the end, most things, if they get broken, can be mended. The risk is always offset, and risk it is, by the emotional and intellectual impact that comes from close encounters with the past. My own life was changed when I was 5, and a curator in the British Museum saw me struggling to see a 3,000-year-old piece of Egyptian cake at the back of a case. He got out his keys, he opened the case, he extracted the cake and put it in front of my nose. It was wondrous, and it was the first time I'd ever come so close to something from the living but dead past. And I've seen school kids transfixed when in Cambridge I've got the real ancient Greek pots out of their glass cases and handed them round. The risk-benefit analysis is obvious. If you want people to care about the past, you've got to let them get close to it and own it. Now, the trust is lucky in a way because it doesn't have too many glass cases. But you do see the same effect as the opening of the case, when it chooses to liberate books from its library shelves, let people actually read them, or in the property's kitchens, whose appeal, I think, is not just that most of us now find it easier to identify with the servants, because in the kitchens there aren't so many ropes and teasels. Right? Now, here I would follow Octavia Hill. She wrote about creating outdoor sitting rooms for the people. I would like to create a few more indoor sitting rooms for the people, just as you see at Sudbury. I hope. Now, there, the long gallery has been equipped with toys of the wholesome wooden sort, no plastic, which I'm sure Hill herself would have much approved. While the kids play, mums and dads can sit down, as there are chairs, and they can talk. My own eavesdropping suggests that some are talking about who's doing the school run on Monday, some are talking about how to read the portraits on the opposite wall. Now that gestures to my second point about the role of historical debate. I don't for a minute want to suggest that the Trust should be trying to control the topics of conversation in its houses, make them a kind of exclusively historical zone. I do think it has an obligation to provide an enabling environment for people, not just to admire the past, though they can do that if they wish, but to understand it better, to discuss it, to debate it, face up to its horrors and to its implications for us. In other words, to own it again. Now, that isn't always as easy as it sounds, as we can see back at Durham. You may have noticed in the picture I showed before, against the rear wall, two stands or side tables, that's how they're described on a nearby notice, each featuring a kneeling, chained black slave. These are, for obvious reasons, hugely controversial and for some deeply offensive. Should they be on display at all? Should they be exactly where they are, as they have been for centuries? Or should they perhaps be put somewhere less conspicuous off the main visitor route, not disposed of, but in a kind of largely unseen, in internal exile? And how should any information provided mediate and present them to visitors? Now, there's an understandable tendency, both here and elsewhere in trust properties, to try to establish an explicitly moral line about what we're looking at. But you have to be careful. Instructing visitors what to think can come across, and does, I think, often come across, as exclusionary as red ropes and teasels. There are no correct answers to those questions, nor is it clear to me who has a right to decide about them. But on the basic issue of where these stands should be, I've come to think that they should stay put where they've always been. That's partly because they are the most visible sign of the exploitation that underlies the extravagant foreignness of the house and its contents, its decoration, even its food. Without them, that foreignness of Durham, which is so well on display now, that foreignness remains misleadingly benign, as if the place had kind of been stocked from a 17th century equivalent of Waitrose, you know what I mean? The kiwis and the mangoes and all that. But it's also because these stands are making a point to us too about our own versions of exploitation. They're not just pointing to the crimes of the past, but also reminding us of how we too are implicated in those crimes with our smartphones and our cheap T-shirts made in places we never go by people we don't ever see. I remember cheering when the statue of Edward Colston was toppled, if for no other reason than that popular action had finally defeated years of local authority inaction. It didn't take long before I spotted the glaring irony in the fact that I had been enjoying the toppling of a 17th century slave trader on my 21st century iPhone. This country, like many others, has a nasty and inglorious record of carefully keeping its exploitation out of sight. Removing this pair to a back room not only lets the past off the hook, it lets us off the hook too. These guys are pointing to the complexities of history and to our own entanglement in that. But to return for the last couple of minutes to the theme of the history of the trust that I explored earlier, because these figures also remind me of the trust's own inevitable entanglement in the historical complexities that it puts on display. I already stressed the fissures, fault lines, and arguments that have always been at the centre of the trust's operation. Another way of thinking about that lies in resisting any idea of the trust as a neutral organisation which conveys the past to us free of its own ideology or ambivalences. The more I've read about the trust history, the more puzzling, complicated, shifting and hard to pin down it seemed. It did come as a bit of a shock to discover, for example, that the reforming Octavia Hill was vehemently opposed to women's suffrage. It was also a surprise, after all the trust's righteous lamentations about the industrial developments at the Falls of Foyers, to discover that the now disused aluminium plant, which you see here, which was erected when the trust failed to prevent it, that now disused aluminium plant had itself become part of cherished historic heritage and is now a Scottish listed building. And it was only after my visit to Durham, and after reflecting on those stands or side tables, that I read with unease another mission statement in the Trust's annual report for 1896. If it were not for the preservation of the places of historic interest and natural beauty, it said, how else, and I'm now quoting, how else would England hold the affections of her sons who far away are colonising the waste places of the earth? Right? We're doing this for those who are colonising the waste places of the earth. Think about it. It was openly and unashamedly painting the trust itself as an arm of empire. Now, it's some of those complexities that Bennett was trying to expose in his People. He was, as I said, needling the trust, to be sure, but he was also exploring some of its ambivalences and uncertainties. It is hugely to the trust's credit, I think, that in this case, they kept their sense of humour. They don't always keep a sense of humour, but with Bennett, they were brilliant. And in their best response to Bennett, they said with a twinkle, after a bit of boasting about their own popularity compared with his theatre audience, they said, we also look after over 550 chamber pots, although unfortunately most are empty. So long live the chamber pot, I think. Thank you very much.